Okay, grade 11s, I had to start my video over because I just had an interruption here. So I'm just going to start by going over this with you again. It is highlighted, okay, and that's because it's my second take on the video at the beginning. So what I want you to know is that fungi are heterotrophs. They have to consume. So they were put into their own category, their own kingdom because of that. They are not plants. They were in with the plants for a while, but then it was discovered that they had to consume, and that makes them a heterotroph. They are eukaryotes. They have a nucleus, and so they are part of eukarya. Okay, they have cell walls. Now those cell walls are made of chitin. Okay, so when we look at plants in a week or so, plants have cell walls made of cellulose. All right, fungi have cell walls that are made out of chitin. What you need to know about fungi is they have these extensions. This is one thing you need to know. So they've got these cells, and I know this note is scanned, so it's not a perfect quality. If you want to look up the term hyphae, you can find all kinds of images on the internet. What you're looking at are these individual cells that look like straws. So what a fungus does is it sends out its digestive enzymes through this hyphae. So it's an extension, okay? It's an extension of its own, we'll say body. It doesn't really have a body, but you get what I mean. And it sends out digestive ooze, basically, onto the food source that it wants to eat. That ooze, the digestive enzymes decompose the food, and the fungi brings that food digested back into itself through the hyphae. So it digests outside of its own organism. All right? Each hyphae is a continuous cell, and again, that cell walls are made up of chitin. These hyphae will contain cytoplasm, a nucleus, and a cell wall. All right, and again, this is a picture of hyphae. So those are general characteristics of the kingdom fungi. Fungi use spores to reproduce. So a spore is like a fungus baby. And once the fungi reproduce sexually, they send off these spores. And the spores can remain dormant for a very long period of time. And when they find the correct environment, a very good environment, then the spores turn back into fungi and they start to become living again. All right? So the question I would ask you if you were in front of me is, why do you get fungus on bread, and how does that come to be? So if you go and you buy a loaf of bread at Fortino's, and you let it sit for a week out in the open, why does it get moldy? And that's because the spores are all around us. They're constantly looking for a good environment, and your bread is a very good environment because it's a food source. So when it lands on the food, when it lands on the bread, it starts to develop its cells again, and it becomes a full-grown fungus, okay? So bread mold is a form of fungus. I showed you a picture on the LMS. Getting onto this page, you would see that strawberry with the mold on it. That's another really good source of food for fungi. And that's because fungi need warm, moist places. So they will take cool places. You know that your strawberries will go moldy in the fridge, but they need that moisture. So as soon as you've got moisture, fungi are pretty happy. So some places you're going to find fungi are on damp tree barks, wet tiles, and moist foods, okay? So athlete's foot, which we'll get to, from wet tiles in public pools especially, okay? Down here I have a picture of a mushroom. I was trying to choose an interesting video for you guys just to see fungi and something that wouldn't be long so that you would actually watch it. And there are many of them out there, but some of them were just maybe not so appropriate because they talked about the psychedelic nature of drugs and mushrooms. But what I wanted you to know is that one of the videos I watched when I was preparing to show you a video was on mushrooms, and it really showed us that there's an interconnected network underneath the ground. So when I get to mushrooms, and I'm going to get to them soon, I want you to know that when you see the mushroom cap like this is just the top of the organism. In reality, the mushrooms are actually growing underground. And this one video that I watched compared them to the internet, because under the ground, you've got all these connections between mushrooms that most people wouldn't even know about. So I thought I would share that with you, okay? So reproduction in fungi. Here are some things you need to know. So most fungi can reproduce sexually and asexually, all right? So you've got both options if you're a fungus. Asexual reproduction means you're going to reproduce identical to a parent. So in other words, it's mitosis, and you're going to produce offspring that are identical to the parent. So one way that can happen is called budding, okay? And so there are no spores produced. You're just reproducing one fungus breaks into two. So one particular type of fungus that does this is yeast. So you might not have known that yeast is a fungus, but it is. And so you start with a parent yeast plant or yeast cell. it forms this bud, okay? So this is why we call it budding. It forms a bud there, and eventually the bud forms a nucleus, and when it has enough cytoplasm and enough of that cell wall, then it will split in half, and you get two yeast cells, okay? So not quite like mitosis, because mitosis starts the division of the nucleus first, and then you start to form that extra cell with cytokinesis. This one does the opposite. It starts to form a bud, and then they'll form a nucleus. All right, fragmentation is similar, okay? It's asexual as well. Part of the fungus breaks off and produces a whole new organism, okay? And I'm just going to leave it at that. It's similar to this. When you have spores, then you have sexual reproduction in a fungus, okay? So the two fungi have hyphae, which intertwine, so it's going to take two fungi. We have sexual reproduction. And what's the key to sexual reproduction? Genetic material is exchanged, okay? When will a fungus do this? When the conditions are unfavorable. So if you've got a fungus that's living on a strawberry and it's doing really well, okay, or the yeast that's living in the bread with all that sugar to digest, it's just going to keep reproducing like this. They're happy, they're reproducing. But when they realize that they're stressed, okay, and the environment is not great, what they're going to do is they're going to package their genes up with another organism, and they're going to make spores. And spores can remain dormant for a long period of time. So it preserves their genetic material, and this will wait until the conditions are proper, and then the conditions are good for growth, and then it'll start to live again, okay? So offspring is dispersed through spores. Spores are easily spread by wind or animals, so they don't really have any trouble leaving. A lot of us are allergic to these spores. We're allergic to molds, okay? And that's because, how do we sense that they're in the air? It's because they are in the air and we're sensing them, okay? So that didn't make much sense, but we're sensing the fact that they're in the air, and a lot of us are allergic to this, okay? And spores, what's my point? Spores can move very, very easily in the wind, okay? Now we're going to get into kinds. So kinds of fungi. So we've got thread-like fungi, and that's mold. So all you have to do is picture a piece of mold. You can Google a picture of a piece of bread mold, and you'll see that coming out of that mold, you might not have noticed it before, but you've got these thread-like substances, okay? And so it's called thread-like fungi because on the mold, on the bread itself, okay, and here I go trying to draw a slice of bread. That's not a mushroom, it's a slice of bread. You would actually have, if you looked at the patches, you could actually see that there would be threads coming up out of the mold. Okay, so if we had some bluish green mold, if you looked at this, you would actually see that it's fuzzy. Okay, and sometimes way back when we were allowed to, we would grow this kind of thing. All right, have to be careful because you don't know what kind of fungus you're growing when you do this because you're not sure exactly what spores are in the air. Okay, sac-like fungi or sac fungi is the largest group of fungi, and this is where we get our yeast. Okay, so yeast, powdery mildew, and truffles. Now, truffles are something that, this is not like the chocolate you would buy at Laura Secord. Truffles are a delicacy in many parts of the world, and a lot of them grow in France. So they have dogs to sniff these truffles out, okay? And powdery mildew is just, it's a mildew, okay? So sac-like fungi, largest group of fungi. When they produce, sexually, they form a sac called an ascus, and that's part of where their name comes from, okay? You will not see this in your lab because we're not doing the lab, and the lab was pretty much torture, so you can just be happy about that because I'd make you look at fungus under the microscope and have to search all these asci out, okay? So yeast reproduce through budding. These are sac-like fungus, and some of these guys are parasites. Okay, and one specific example of that is Dutch elm disease. Sorry, my cat is in the video and I'm just going to leave her in there. So, club fungus. Now, these are the ones you would picture. If I said think of a fungus, most of you guys would picture a mushroom, and that's what a club fungus is. So, it's called a club fungus because if you look at the mushroom, the top of the mushroom looks like a club. Okay? So most of the mushroom is underground. I've mentioned that to you. Okay, they are interconnected all over the earth in an amazing network. So if you're interested, look it up. They contain special hyphae to form club-like structures called basidia, and that's what these guys are. Okay, so the hyphae form the basidia, which is really the bulk of that mushroom head. Okay, so when do we see these guys? when we have had some rain, especially in August, if we get a really rainy July, you'll start to see them come up in August. What is this evidence of? It's not that the mushroom has just come to life. It's evidence of that underground network I was telling you about. And so now the fungus has done extremely well, and it can send up evidence of itself, okay? And it can reproduce as a result. So they contain special hyphae that can form a club-like structure called basidia. And non-mushroom fungi include things like puffballs, rusts, and smuts. So sometimes when we get a super rainy summer, we get grass rust, and it's like a brown film on the grass. You might not notice it on your entire lawn, hopefully, but you might notice a little bit of it on a few leaves of the grass, and that's actually a fungus, okay? And it looks like rust, so they call it rust. We have imperfect fungi, all right? And so what's important here, these guys don't belong to the other groups, so they don't fit into the other groups, so they're called imperfect because their physical form isn't like the other groups. But one of the most important types of fungus to us is in this group, and it's penicillium. And I'm not saying that incorrectly. It's not penicillin, it's penicillium. So penicillium was discovered by Fleming, okay? And so Fleming discovered penicillium, and from that he made penicillin. Now, what is penicillium? It's a form of fungus that actually eats bacteria. Okay, so I told you guys that these guys are heterotrophs. Fungi are heterotrophs. They have to consume. And what Fleming did was he was trying to help people because there was, I believe it was pneumonia at the time that was rampaging through the world, much like we're in trouble right now, a little bit of trouble with a virus. They had bacterial infections. And so he was trying to cultivate, he was growing his bacteria to see what he could do to make a cure for bacteria, and he left one of his petri dishes open. So instead of like capping the petri dish, and we put a cover on the petri dish, and we would tape it together. So in most cases, if we were growing any kind of fungus, well, he forgot to tape one of his, or put the cap back on his, or the top back on his petri dish, and what ended up happening was fungus got in there because there were spores being sent. And the spores landed on the agar, and they loved that because it was moist and it was a food source. And they grew. And when they grew, they ate the bacteria. They consumed the bacteria. So he discovered a fungus that eats bacteria. And to this day, we use this fungus to make penicillin. So this is the fungus. Okay, that's the actual name. And penicillin, it makes penicillin. So it is not penicillin. What we get from it is penicillin, okay? And I said to you that many of us are allergic to molds. That's a very, very common allergy. And so many people are allergic to penicillin because it comes from a fungus, okay? So if you have a penicillin allergy, it totally makes sense. All right, lichens. So this is symbiosis. They come from a fungus and an algae, okay? So fungus and algae living together form a lichen. Again, something you could look up a picture of. They're actually kind of nice looking. The algae lives inside the protective walls of the fungus. Okay, so the fungus protects the algae, all right? And the fungus gets moisture. So it's mutualistic. They both benefit. And then how do we use fungi in nature? Okay, they are recyclers. So you've got fungi, you've got bacteria. These guys are always competing to decompose materials because that's how they're getting their energy. All right, so fungi are also decomposers. They're saprophytes. They decompose dead or dying materials, okay? They'll help work on the leaves from the fall, for instance, right now, and they'll work on the carcasses of animals. Okay, another role of fungi is we use them as baker's yeast. So we throw yeast into our breads. Okay, the yeast benefit because they start to eat the sugar in the bread, and that's what you smell. When you smell bread baking, you actually smell the yeast eating that sugar. And the yeast give off a gas as a result, and the gas they give off is carbon dioxide gas, and that's what makes your bread rise. Okay? All right, so we use them to make breads. We use them to make beers. Okay, so different types of beer. It's really popular right now to have all these craft beers. What the people that are making the beer are doing is they're using different species of yeast. So different species will provide a different flavor, and you'll get different types of beers as a result, okay? Blue cheese is not cheese at all. It is completely a fungus, all right? And then the one that you would think of if I said what kind of fungus do people eat, you would think of mushrooms, and that's another form of fungus. Okay, so those are different roles. Organisms eat mushrooms, all right? They eat them all the time. It's not just humans that eat them, so they're a food source for many different things in nature. They are disease fighting in the form of penicillium that makes penicillin. And then they also cause disease because, like I said to you guys, they are consuming. So if organisms get a yeast infection, athlete's foot, corn gets corn smut, wheat gets wheat rust, it's because the fungus is taking advantage of that organism and starting to consume it. So on the next page with your questions, I gave you a picture of athlete's foot. It's not that clear anymore, so I would suggest you Google a picture, but there's the fungus, and it's eating a hole in the person's foot. So this person let it go way too far, and now the fungus is helping to eat that foot. It thinks it's decomposing a foot, it's eating it, okay? So if you ever walk on wet tiles, use flip-flops because the fungus for athlete's foot is living and doing very well there, and it's looking for a host, okay? You cannot treat infections that are caused by fungus with an antibiotic. An antibiotic is completely used for bacteria. It will not touch a fungus. You have to get a fungicide. Okay, a fungicide kills a fungus because a fungus has different properties than bacteria. An antibiotic doesn't do anything at all to a fungus. Okay, a fungicide will know how to break down the cell walls of the fungus. Lichens, almost done here. Lichens are pioneer organisms that come back after devastation. They are fungus. So after devastation, I would mean like forest fires. So for instance, Australia went through a very devastating season of forest fires. Once the lichens come back in, they start to decompose any waste at all, and they start to make a nice rich soil. So when lichens return to an environment, that's a really good sign that the environment's picking up. All right? Mycorrhizae have a symbiotic, that's how you say that, mycorrhizae have a symbiotic relationship living on plant roots. So the fungus absorbs sugars the plant doesn't mind, made by the plant, and the plant absorbs water and minerals with the aid of the fungus. So they work together, okay? And that is symbiosis. And that is fungus. I'm done with the fungi, okay? So you've got 2 days to work through all the questions I've given you. I do recommend watching that video. And there are other short clips too that show you. What's the point of this is that you understand and start to respect other life forms, okay? So we always study animals and plants. This is your introduction to other life forms. So if you do have a time, take a couple minutes and look at some video clips on mushrooms and their underground network. It's kind of cool.